In a 2019 after-party held at the Metacraft Cinema, Ari Aster describes his second installment, Midsommar, as such: "It's a Wizard of Oz for perverts." Referring to the 1940 children's classic, The Wizard of Oz, follows the story of Dorothy, who gets swept up in a dust storm whilst living on her farmland in Kansas. She wakes up and is met outside with the colourful world of Oz. From here, she goes on a journey to meet the Wizard of Oz to help her find her way home, and during her travels, she's accompanied by 3 unique characters, all of whom seek to meet the wizard. Throughout her travels, she's frequently accosted by the Wicked Witch of the West, who aims to take back the red shoes from Dorothy that originally belonged to her recently deceased sister. Ironically, Midsommar, despite its horror genre, tributes many of its storytelling elements to the Wizard of Oz. The film begins with psychology student Danny looking for support from her boyfriend Christian after her bipolar sister Terry sends her ominous messages. This soon follows with her sister Terry ending her life by carbon monoxide poisoning, along with Danny's parents who were sleeping in the same house. Both Midsommar and Oz share a parallel in this regard, as both films opens the story with the death of a sister. Something to note about Oz is that there is a large emphasis on Dorothy trying to get back to her home in Kansas. However, in Midsommar, Danny's home primarily consisted of her parents and sister who are no longer around. Therefore, Danny no longer has a home to return to, and the remnants of her old life she clings to exist in her distant boyfriend Christian, who she was dating before the passing of her family. And as she is invited on a trip to spend Midsommar in Sweden, in essence she goes on a journey to find her home in the same way that Dorothy does. At the beginning of the film, the first image we are introduced to is a mural of all the key events that will occur for our protagonist Danny. The first being the death of her family, moving on to her trip to the Haga, and ending with the Maypole dance. Something to note is the middle panel of Danny's journey to the Haga depicts a yellow path of flowers right before she enters the village. This is reminiscent of the yellow brick road we see Dorothy cross before reaching Emerald City. The custom of picking flowers and sleeping with them under your pillow to manifest your hopes and desires is reminiscent to the poppy field that puts Dorothy and the gang to sleep. This gang that Dorothy picks up during her travels consists of the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. In parallel, Danny is also accompanied by 3 travel companions, those being her boyfriend Christian and his 2 schoolmates Mark and Josh. But it doesn't just stop there, as we will observe throughout the film Danny's 3 travel companions sharing much of the same qualities as their Oz counterparts. Mark to the Scarecrow, Josh to the Tin Man, and Christian to the Cowardly Lion. Beginning with Mark, the first time we see this likeness is a portrait of the Scarecrow atop of the fridge in Mark and Josh's apartment. The Scarecrow is known for his lack of a brain, which characterizes him as the foolish one. This foolishness is attributed to Mark, who is often depicted taking action without thought and often talks incessantly over trivial topics, such as describing the trip to Sweden as an authentic hippie midsummer on Pell's yodeling farm, without considering if Danny knew about the trip, digging into his food bowl before receiving the go-ahead from the Haga elders, and urinating on the ancestral tree without considering if it had historical meaning to the Haga, just as Elder Oof rushes forward to berate him. Something to note is that the film script that entails all obscenities of Oof includes stick for fun stick, meaning stick the stick. The first time Dorothy meets the Scarecrow, he is holstered up by a wooden stick. Dorothy asks how he can talk without a brain, and the Scarecrow replies, "I don't know, but some people without brains do an awful lot of talking," a characteristic that Mark is often portrayed exhibiting. However, unlike the Scarecrow, who finishes his story by receiving a degree in thinkology from the wizard, this degree that which symbolizes a brain, Mark finishes his story by being murdered and then flayed where only his skin remains. And as he is stuffed with hay and donned with a jester's hat, his last appearance on the screen is of him as a scarecrow without a brain. This twist in story arcs shows how the travel companions of Midsommar do not transform from their flaws but instead succumb to them and ultimately to their demise. In this regard, it was Mark's foolishness that led to his death. In the case of Josh, he shares many attributes to the Tin Man. The first time Josh speaks, he comments on Christian's relationship as such. Do you think there is a masochistic part of you that is playing out this particular drama to avoid the work you actually need to be doing? This mechanical string of words is cold and emotionless, which is referencing to the Tin Man whose main quality is that he lacks a heart. However, in The Wizard of Oz, heart takes on a slightly different meaning. When the Tin Man receives his quote-unquote heart, it is one that represents not emotion, but instead is a testimonial, a token of the wizard's esteem and affection. This testimonial, being a heart-shaped clock, is received when the wizard describes it as a reward for people for simply doing good deeds. Therefore, the heart that the Tin Man receives is not one that will give him emotion, but instead he wins the hearts of others from being a good deed doer. Simply, it is the adoration of others. Something to note is that at the start of the film, the Kansas counterpart to the Tin Man is a farmhand named Hickory who says to Dorothy, "They're going to erect a statue of me someday." This implies his desire to be recognized and his desire to win the hearts of others. In Midsommar, Josh follows a similar parallel where he desires to be recognized as the first discoverer of the Haga community for his thesis. This is portrayed with his argument with Christian, where Christian discloses that he too is going to write his thesis on the Haga village, much to Josh's dismay. Something to note is that Josh has helped Christian with his university assignments in the past. As to quote from the script, "I have to hold your little hand through everything. You don't even know how to use JSTAR before I taught you, and you're a grad student." Josh is upset because he does not want to share in the glory of discovering the unique customs of the Haga with anyone but himself. The recognition and accolades he wishes to receive for his thesis are only to his name alone, and without the collaboration of Christian or anyone else for the matter. When Josh rejects Christian's involvement, it leads to competition amongst the two friends who aspire to outdo one another in their assignments. This results in Josh sneaking out at night to take pictures of the Ruby Radia, where he is then bludgeoned to death. A common mistake that people make of this scene is that Josh was led by his thirst for knowledge as shown from his academic prowess. But in reality, he was led by his ambition, wanting to be the first one to uncover the customs of the Haga traditions and to outdo his competition, Christian. A token of esteem and affection that the Tin Man receives is what Josh desires, and this fatal flaw is what leads him to his death. As a result, Josh's body is suspended upside down where half his body is buried. This is similar in the same way the Tin Man is first introduced, where he is suspended in a woodcutting position. Where Josh's body is clogged with dirt, the Tin Man is clogged with rust, giving both of them a sense of unmoving and a sense of stillness. Lastly, the final screening of Josh depicts his dead body with pages of the Ruby Radia being stuffed in his mouth. Something to mention is that when Josh was inquiring about the Ruby Radia for his thesis, the elder that shows him describes it as such, emotional sheet music. Emphasis on the word emotional, as the Haga have been depicted throughout the film communicating with each other through emotion. The stuffing of these pages down his throat is a metaphor for stuffing emotion into his body, where, unlike the Tin Man who earns the hearts of others, Josh has been given a version of a heart in the form of the Ruby Radia, a twisted piece of symbolism in which the Haga try to make Josh emphasize with their emotions in the same way they emphasize with each other. Where Mark is the Scarecrow, Josh being the Tin Man, the last counterpart to attribute is Danny's boyfriend Christian to the Cowardly Lion. While the name is self-explanatory, the Cowardly Lion's main quality is that he lacks courage, as portrayed from his proclivity to run away from dangerous situations. In parallel, the first appearance of Christian is of him sitting in a bar with Mark and Josh discussing why he hasn't broken off the relationship with Danny. He answers to quote, "What if I regret it later and can't get her back?" He lacks the courage to end the relationship because of his fear of regret. After Mark mentions the Sweden trip, Danny confronts Christian about it only for Christian to double down and apologize without wanting to discuss anything. Christian resorts to apologies first because he lacks the courage to tell Danny about his distant feelings for her, hence why he never mentioned the trip to Sweden in the first place. This becomes a common pattern for the cowardly Christian because his lack of courage stems from his fear of consequence. Simply, he does not want to face the consequences of his actions. This cowardice soon manifests in the betrayal of his friend Josh, where after an elder comes forward asking about the whereabouts of Josh and the Ruby Red Deer, Christian exclaims that Josh, on the other hand, if he did take that book, I just pray you understand we don't associate as his friends or his collaborators or anything. In this regard, he distances his friendship with Josh in hopes to distance himself from whatever consequence Josh may face when confronted. Lastly, Christian's final act of cowardice takes him to a building of naked women with Maya at its center. Something to mention is that during Christian's first appearance, a black and white photograph of Sophia Loren's and James Mansfield's breasts float over his head. This scene foreshadows his sex scene with Maya, whilst the breasts of the naked Haga women hover over him during intercourse. Christian, who is often portrayed as a man of inactivity, who is never proactive in steering the direction of his future, succumbs to infidelity, betraying the relationship he has with Danny and never overcoming his cowardice. Observe the cowardly way in which he runs away from his misdeed of breeding with Maya. In The Wizard of Oz, the cowardly lion who overcomes his cowardice is gifted with the Triple Cross, granting him inaugural entry into the Legion of Courage. Something to note is that one of the songs sung by the cowardly lion is called If I Were King of the Forest, which entails how courage would make him a king. This theme of monarchy carries over in Midsommar, where Danny, who is now the May Queen, chooses Christian to be the ninth sacrifice as a form of a knighting ceremony, which is typically done to men who have made extraordinary services to the royal family. According to the Haga, it is a great honor to be chosen as a sacrifice since your death will be used to ward off wickedness from the commune. In a twisted way, Christian obtains his own medal of courage for his sacrifice despite never developing past his cowardly ways. However, instead of being placed inside a lion, which would be on theme with the cowardly lion, he instead is placed inside a disemboweled bear. Earlier in the film, we see a painting of a young girl kissing a bear. This is foreshadowing of the bear suit that Christian was placed in for his sacrifice. The painting is an illustration by John Bower for the children's tale Oskildens Vandring, aka The Walk of Innoncence. This follows the story of a young princess named Bella who escapes from her castle into the forest during summer. Along her journey through the forest, she comes across dangerous animals such as a snake, a bear, a raven, a swan, and an eagle. And with each interaction, she loses an article of clothing. Before the last animal, the eagle, returns her back to the castle with nothing on. Bella is often described amongst the pine trees, immersing in nature before taking a deep breath. This is similar to the way the Haga are often portrayed inhaling deeply amongst their commune hidden within the forest. The John Bower illustration in the film is referencing Bella's interaction with the bear. In this part of the story, Bella comes across a berry bush where she begins gorging on raspberries. She pockets some raspberries along her travels where at some point she stumbles across a large bear. Bella, being an innocent child, thought the bear was a dog and offered raspberries for the bear to eat. Bella notices the thick fur coat of the bear and how hot he must be in the summer heat. She runs her hand across its fur, then kisses it on the nose, empathizing how it cannot take off its skin in the summer. This is then followed with two of its bear cubs appearing, where Bella, who runs out of raspberries, takes the two cubs to the raspberry patch, where they fill their stomachs and run off into the forest, leaving Bella alone. This interaction with the bear exemplifies Bella's innocence, where Bella, thinking the bear was a dog, did not understand how dangerous the bear truly was to her. If Bella did not feed the bear raspberries, then the bear would have likely fed on Bella. Something to mention is that when Dorothy was swept up in the land of Oz, along with her was her dog Toto. Toto to Dorothy is a symbol of a piece of her home from Kansas, since Toto was with Dorothy before the dust storm and is essentially a relic of her old life. Similarly, Christian acts in the same way as Toto, since Christian was dating Danny at the time of her family's death and remains as the last relic of her home life before the suicides. Therefore, just like Bella, Danny sees Christian as the dog and does not understand that he is in fact the dangerous bear that poses a threat to her. And when she catches Christian being unfaithful, Danny no longer sees Christian as the innocent dog, but instead the dangerous bear that soiled their relationship. Therefore, Christian, through his cowardly actions as the cowardly lion, becomes the dangerous bear, and as the flames surround him, he becomes the bear whose skin is too hot to take off, just like the story in the Walk of Innocence. As we establish that Dani is Dorothy finding her way through Oz, a key part of her journey isn't just exclusive to finding her home, but more importantly, to overcome the grief she has towards her passing family. Referring back to the mural at the start of the film, we see in the first panel of Dani being entangled by the deaths of her parents and sister with a skeleton holding the rope. This panel is noted for its dark atmosphere, with a skull at the top in place of a moon. The themes of death is often associated with darkness, as it's shown at the beginning, where the deaths of Dani's family occurs at night. During a close-up on Terry's body, we can see to the left is a poster of a girl staring at a black fish pond. This poster is another illustration belonging to artist John Boer, but for a different story titled Princess Tustvar and the Fish Pond. In this story, it follows Princess Tustvar, who slips away from the dream castle where she is accompanied by an elk to protect her from the dangers in the dark forest. However, the elk isn't strong enough, and little by little her innocence along with articles of her clothing is taken from her, leaving her with nothing on but a golden heart necklace. This is very similar to the Walk of Innocence, as Princess Bella has her innocence being taken along with her garments, leaving her naked at the end of her story. However, unlike Bella, who gets back home, Tustvar, who looks deep into the black fish pond, has her golden heart necklace slip over her head and drop into the pond where it is lost forever. The golden chain is symbolic of Tustvar's last remaining innocence. Therefore, Tustvar stays to search for her chain, only to sit on a hillock staring into the black fish pond, where after years of being there, she turns into a slender plant crowned with white cotton. To quote the final sentence of the story, "Still, Princess Tustvar sits and looks wonderingly into the dark depths of the water." This is in parallel to Terry's email to Dani before her suicide as to quote, "I can't anymore. Everything's black. Mom and Dad are coming too. Goodbye." Just like Tustvar, Terry's loss of innocence to the black fish pond in her mind is realized, and her death becomes a motif in the form of darkness throughout. Therefore, when we find Dani in dark spaces, it is often associated with elements of death, such as when she has a bad trip and enters a dark bathroom, we see a glimpse of her dead sister Terry in the mirror. During Dani's dream sequence, it conveys Dani getting up in the middle of the night watching her 3 friends drive off in their car, abandoning her. As she screams, black smoke exudes from her mouth. This is reminiscent of the same smoke that was used in Terry's death. Dani, dreaming of herself being left in the dark, manifests her fear of her friends never truly caring for her, which is indicative of her own innocence being stripped from her, much like the way Dani left Terry alone to the black, where Terry's innocence was lost. This is also referencing to Princess Tustvar, whose innocence was taken from her in the darkness of the forest, and the elk leaving her alone to be turned into a plant. Dani being surrounded by black smoke reinforces the concept that she has not moved on from the deaths of her family, as the last remaining pieces of her innocence being with Christian remains true. Something to mention is that despite the motif of death being found in these dark places in the film, these dark places are far and few, since the story is set in the Midsommar, where sunlight is typically observed for 20 hours of the day. Therefore, we see Dani deal with her grief in the light rather than the dark. The first time Dani is reintroduced to death is during the Attestputan sacrifice in the light of day. Whilst Connie and Simon become distraught at the sight, Dani is transfixed, almost opening her mind to a new way of dealing with death. The conductor of this ritual, Siv, to quote, "Those 2 who jumped have reached the end of their Haga life cycle, and you need to understand it is a great joy for them. Instead of getting old and dying in pain and fear and shame, we give our life as a gesture before it can spoil. It does no good dying and lashing back at the inevitable. It corrupts the spirit." This is transformative for Dani. Since the beginning of the film, it has been revealed that Dani has intervened many times to stop her sister from harming herself. The idea of death being inevitable, and to perhaps understand it as a great joy, challenges Dani's grief and marks the development of Dani's relationship with death. When Dani participates in the Maypole dance, Omar, who conducts this ritual, sermons the Maypole dialogue, "It was here, long ago that the Black One lured the youths of the Hagar to the grass and seduced them into dance. Once they began, they could not stop, and they danced themselves to death. Now, in life-holding defiance of the Black One, we dance until we fall, and she who survives last will be crowned for her stamina. As we establish that darkness is associated with death, then we can only assume that the Black One is referring to death itself. Therefore, this ritual is quite literal in overcoming death as described by its life-holding defiance to the Black One. If we harken back to the mural at the start of the film, we see Dani being entangled by the deaths of her loved ones with a skeleton holding the rope. But in the panel of the maypole, Dani is dancing with the skeletons. In a literal sense, she is dancing with death. And Dani, being crowned the winner, marks her evolution from being strangled with grief to realizing her stamina in dealing with the Black One, and the joyful dance she displays at the maypole is on trend with the great joy that Silva describes when giving your life as a gesture. Therefore, after being crowned the May Queen, Dani hallucinates her dead mother in the crowd. Unlike the bathroom scene where she is horrified to hallucinate her sister, over here she is not overwhelmed, but instead it depicts her new Hagar family embracing her and in a sense escorting her away from her grief, that being away from the direction her dead mother has walked off to. Something that Mark, Josh and Christian have in common is their inability to empathize with Dani. Dani, who has shown to be a carer for her bipolar sister Terry, seeks support from Christian when Terry does not respond to her emails. This is met with Christian telling Dani to quote, "She does this every other day and only because you let her." This is an unempathic response since Christian is blaming Dani for giving in to her sister's quote, ploy for attention. After the death of Dani's family, Mark, who is typically informed of Dani's struggles, shows vexation at the idea of Dani coming along to their trip to Sweden. Josh, who is immersed in his thesis, is too distracted to show any emotional or cognitive empathy to Dani's situation, and Christian, who has been wanting out of this relationship, continues to show lack of concern for her throughout the trip, such as when after the gang witnessed the Attestputan involving 2 commune members being sacrificed, Dani, who is about to break down, is left by Christian, who prioritizes arguing with Josh about doing his thesis on the Hagar rather than consoling her. And again, when Dani comes to inform him about one of the visitors, Connie, being absent, just to be dismissed as Christian competes with Josh over information gathering for his thesis. This lack of empathy for Dani is a regular pattern throughout the movie, and it isn't until she sits down with Pell, who shows her the first moment of understanding by telling her about how he lost his parents in a fire. To quote, "So believe me when I say I know what that is, because I do, yet my difference is I didn't get a chance to feel lost because I had a family here where everyone embraced me." On the topic of Christian, Pell asks Dani, "But do you feel held by him, Dani? Does he feel like home to you?" This motif of Dani finding her home is reintroduced as we have established that she is Dorothy trying to find her home through Oz, with Christian being Toto or the relic of her home life before her family's passing. This challenges her perspective on Christian, since Pell implies that Christian, if he truly was a piece of her home, then she wouldn't feel such a severe loss as Christian would have been there to embrace her. The way the Hagar embrace each other is often portrayed through sharing emotions. More so, the way they understand each other and empathize with each other is by literally feeling the emotions of one another. The first time we see this is during the Attestputan, where the second sacrifice, Dan, who fails to die, screams in pain after his leg is shattered. In response to his screams, the Hagar scream as well. Initially, these screams were interpreted to be a morbid disappointment towards the failed sacrifice, or the sacrifice failing to die. But in reality, they are trying to feel the same pain as him, and they express this by literally screaming in the same agony as he does. Notice the woman hunched over grasping at her leg in the same spot that Dan has his leg shattered. These shared emotions are a literal form of empathy that they use to communicate amongst their commune. In the scene where Christian brings Dani a slice of cake after forgetting her birthday, we can observe how out of tune they are during their conversation as Christian fails to light the candle. This is a reminder of how both characters cannot connect on an empathetic level, which juxtaposes with the women in the background who are all rocking in sync when cradling the newborn. Just like with Sacrifice Dan, the Haga share in his pain, whereas in this instance, the women share in their maternal instinct. During Christian and Maya's sex scene, the women begin mimicking Maya's moans, and when Maya reaches out a hand, she is embraced by one of the women during the ritual. This is another example of shared empathy, since the Haga women are physically sharing in their erotica and the intimacy being done to Maya. During the maypole dance, Danny and another participant are drunk in their ecstasy, and as they spin, they speak gibberish with one another, yet still understanding the meaning of what the other is trying to say. To quote Ari Aster from the New York Times, "These people speak the language of empathy, which is something missing in Danny's life." Danny, after discovering Christian's infidelity, is comforted by the Haga women, whom all cry in despair at the same time. In this regard, she is not just being comforted, but she is being held by the women, in the same regard that Pell asks Danny if she felt held by Christian. To quote when Pell talks about his home, "I have always felt held by a family, a real family, which everyone deserves, and you deserve." In a way, this Haga family becomes the home that Danny has been searching for, since the empathy that Christian could not give her is compensated by the empathy of the Haga. Finally, in the last scene of the film, Danny's home welcoming comes to a climax as she is portrayed screaming in pain with the Haga sacrifices inside the burning temple. This ending is in parallel to the passing of her family, as both scenes depicts Danny screaming in pain towards her loved ones perishing in a house filled with smoke. However, unlike the beginning where Danny screams from loss, the ending is of Danny screaming with empathy. This harkens back to what Pell tells Danny about how he never truly felt loss because he had a family to embrace him. In this regard, Danny does not feel the loss of her 3 friends, as she now has the Haga to embrace her as a new member, and the scene where she smiles, she rejoices because she is no longer alone. She rejoices because she now has a family who can empathize with her, literally. But more importantly, it marks the change with her relationship with death, where at the start she is suffocated by it, only to accept it as the great joy on par with the Haga custom. Therefore, she smiles because she has found her home in Oz.